back to Getting Nerdy MTG. I am the Possum. Today we got something a little different. We're going to actually look at a deck tech. This is for my Tuvasa the Sunlit for Commander. Typically when people build this as their Commander, they build more of a Voltron strategy with the basic strategy of play a bunch of enchantments, Tuvasa gets huge, swing in for lethal on Commander damage. However, I say typically people do that. I don't like building decks that everyone else has already built. Doesn't matter if they're better than what I'm playing or not. It's just boring for me. It kind of defeats the purpose of what I enjoy doing. So in this case, my Tuvasa, we went more of a token generation. Now Tuvasa is green, white, and blue, one of each. She's a 1/1. Gets +1/+1 for each enchantment I control. But the real reason she is my commander, other than the fact of the 3 colors that I specifically wanted, was I get to draw a card the first time I play an enchantment each turn, which in this deck should happen at least every turn, and sometimes on my opponent's turns. Now for this video, I'm going to show y'all a couple different prices. Typically, I'll show you the price of this card, or market value of the card, specific for the printing that I have. And then if there is a budget option that is the exact same card, I'll show it down at the bottom. And then at the end of the video, you'll see what you could actually build this deck in or for as I have it built, with some of the prettier, nicer copies, as well as a cheaper version, pretty much all the same cards, just if there are lower price printings available, I'll show you the price for those and how to build the deck with that price point in mind. The only exception to that is going to be the dual lands. There are 3 of the original duels in this deck. If you're going to build it budget, you leave those out altogether. They're not critical, but they are in the deck because I like the idea of collecting them, and since I have them, I'm going to use them. But there again, for the price point, for the amount that it costs to acquire those cards, they don't really add that much reliability to the mana base. But we'll get started. Again, this is for Tuvasa the Sunlit. I have 12 creatures in this deck, not counting the commander. But typically these are cards in the deck, not because they are creatures, but because of the other things they do. For starters, for card draw, we have Sithis of the Harvest Hand, or Sithis Harvest Hand, green and a white. Power and toughness is irrelevant. That's not why she's in here. But this is card draw every time I play an enchantment, plus gaining a life. Curious Crafter for 3 and a blue. No maximum hand size. And whenever a creature token I control deals combat damage to a player, I draw a card. Most of my damage is done with creature tokens, so that would be a fair amount of card draw. The Jukai Naturalist, a green and a white. There again, the power and toughness of 2/2 is fairly irrelevant, as well as the life link. But enchantment spells are one generic less to cast, and he actually counts as an enchantment himself. The Seedborn Muse for 3 green and green. Untap all of my permanents on each controller's untap step. So we're into our ramp at this point with the Jukai Naturalist as well as Seedborn. Lets me untap everything so I can have more mana available to do things on my opponent's turns. Krufix, God of Horizons. Here again, it also counts as an enchantment, so I get triggers for that. He's an indestructible creature. If my devotion to green and blue is 7 or greater, but the reason he's here is I have no maximum hand size, and any unused mana just goes into a pool of colorless to use later. Dryad of the Elysian Grove for 2 and a blue, or 2 and a green, sorry. I can play an additional land each turn, so a little bit of ramp, as well as all of my lands will be every basic land type in addition to its others. So it's also my mana fixing. This is a 3-color deck, so it lets me not have to worry about, do I have the colors I need? Sanctum Weaver, 1 and a green. This is straight up mana ramp. Tap for X mana of any one color. X is number of enchantments I control. In theory, when I do that, it should produce a lot of mana. We're into some what I call enhancement creatures. They're here because of what they do to the other creatures I control, which I said typically that's going to be a lot of tokens. The Archetype of Imagination for 4 blue. My creatures all fly. None of my opponents can fly. Archetype of Endurance, 6 green and green, and it does the same thing, only this time with hexproof. My creatures have hexproof, which means they can't be targeted by anything my opponents are doing. And my opponents' creatures can't have hexproof. Into our token generation, we've got the Errasta of the Endless Web, 2 green and green, 3/5 with reach. Again, not here because it's a creature, but when an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, I create a spider. Archon of Sun's Grace, 2 white and white. When an enchantment enters the battlefield under my control, I get a 2/2 flying Pegasus. My Pegasus creatures will have lifelink. Avenger of Zendikar for 5 green and green. Excuse the glare, like I said, this is a deck that I frequently play, so they are all double sleeved. 5 green and green. When Avenger of Zendikar enters, I get a number of 0/1 plants equal to the number of lands I control. And then whenever a land enters, I put a 1/1 counter on each of my plants. So straight up token generation. I only have 2 artifacts in the deck. You put Soul Ring in every commander deck. It's a straight up given. 1 generic, tap it immediately for 2 colorless. Thalt Vessel, 2 to cast. The main reason this is here is the no maximum hand size. With as much card draw as I hopefully will be doing, that's actually very important. I believe I have 4 different cards that give me no maximum hand. I definitely need one of those on the board as early as possible. We have 14 instants and sorceries in this deck. To start with is my different counter spells. Negate, 1 and a blue, counter target non-creature spell, very straightforward. Dovin's Veto, white and a blue. Same thing as the Negate, counter target non-creature spell, only with Dovin's Veto, this spell can't be countered. Fierce Guardianship, 2 and a blue, but if I control my commander, this spell is free. Counter target non-creature spell. We have Counter Spell. For 2 blue, I can counter any spell. Mana Drain. For 2 blue, I counter a spell, and then at the beginning of my next main phase, I get a number of colorless mana equal to that spell's converted mana cost. So it's a counter spell with a little bit of ramp. Pact of Negation. It's a free counter spell. It's 0 to cast, counter target spell. But at the beginning of my next upkeep, I have to pay 3 blue and blue. So 5, or I lose the game. Pretty steep downside to have to pay 5 the next turn. But being able to play a counter spell with no mana available, your opponents can't really work around that. So they don't. If you have mana available that you could pay for a counter spell, your opponent's going to notice that, and we'll take that into account when they decide what they're doing. With Pact of Negation, they could either assume you have it if you're playing blue, or just play as if you don't have it at all. And our protection spells, Angel's Grace for 1 white. This is basically my combo stopper. Since it has split second, with this on the stack, nothing else can be done, no other abilities, no trick, nothing else can happen until this spell resolves. So they can't do something in response to me casting it. But for 1 turn, I can't lose the game. My opponents can't win the game. They can't kill me by damage, because anything that would drop my life total to less than 1 just makes it 1. It definitely buys me another turn. This comes in very handy against the decks that will run combos. There's various different ones that do it, but basically they draw their entire deck and then win either by what they play out of their deck, or in some cases, they will actually have triggers that say they win the game if they have nothing in their library. This will say they don't win the game that turn, and then on their next turn when they go to draw, they'll actually lose. Cyclonic Rift. Anybody that plays the game knows this card. They know it is an absolute bear to go up against. For 1 and a blue, return a non-land permanent I don't control to its owner's hand, but I can overload it for 6 and blue. And instead of target, it's all non-land permanents I don't control go to their controller, or go to their controller's hands. Heroic Intervention. 1 and a green. Everything I have will gain hexproof and indestructible till end of turn. Teferi's Protection. For 2 and a white. Until the beginning of my next turn, I don't exist. All of my permanents go away. Nothing actually leaves the battlefield. It's just phased out. It can't be targeted, can't be affected in any way. My life total can't change. So it gets me a turn cycle that I will definitely be still in the game at the beginning of my next turn. We've got a little bit of artifact and enchantment removal. Croson Grip, 2 and a green, here again with a split second, so this spell can't be reacted to. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. Sundering Growth. We have 2 hybrids in the Selesnya colors, so 2 green, 2 white, or 2 green or 2 white, or 2 mana of any combination of green and white. Destroy an artifact or enchantment and then populate. So I'll create another token. And our token generation, again, this is kind of the whole point of the deck. Only this is a sorcery for 5 green, 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 so 8 total. For each opponent, or each creature my opponents control, I get a 4/4 green beast, and those beasts fight a different creature each. So this is token generation, and in some cases board wipe, because a lot of the creatures on the board will be smaller than 4/4s. This in combination with, say, the Heroic Intervention, my beasts would all be indestructible, so none of them will die, and at least some of my opponent's creatures would die. There's a little bit of graveyard recursion in this deck. This is a sorcery version of it. For 3 white, 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 so 7 total. It's a very costly spell, but return all artifact and enchantment cards from my graveyard to the battlefield. This is something I wouldn't do until much later game, so the 7 mana cost isn't that big a deal by that point. Into the meat of the deck, there are 34 enchantments in this deck, not counting the enchantment creatures. So if you count those, we're probably closer to 40 enchantments. I wanted to break these down into different categories, but there was so much crossover, I kind of gave up on that. They're somewhat arranged in categories just to make it a little easier to keep track of. But we'll start off with the Wilderness Reclamation. 3 and a green. Beginning of my end step, untap all of my lands, so it's a little bit of ramp. I can do some stuff on my opponent's turns, even though I tapped out on mine. This gives me mana, or gives me lands to utilize to pay for counter spells. If I do have flash, which I do have ways of obtaining flash in this deck, I can do things such as that, as well as the crew fix that stores unused mana. It allows me to dump a lot more into that on my opponent's turns. Carpet of Flowers for a green. This is definitely ramp. During my main phase, I get an X mana of 1 color, where X is number of islands target opponent controls. That target can be a different opponent each time I use it. I basically choose who I want this to apply to, but I can only do it on one of my main phases each turn, and it has to be on my turn. Mana Reflection for 4 green. If I tap a permanent for mana, it produces twice as much, so this is very much a ramp card. Smothering Tithe, another one of the cards that everybody knows. 3 and a white. Opponent draws a card. If they don't pay 2, I get a treasure, which can be sacrificed for a mana of any color. Burgeoning. I didn't know this card existed until I built this deck, but for a green, when an opponent plays a land, if I got a land card in my hand, I can put it on the battlefield. With this, I have started turn 2 with 4 mana on the 4 lands on the board before I played a land for turn. Exploration for a single green. I play an additional land each turn. Mirari's Wake, 3 green and white. My creatures get +1/+1, and when I tap a land for mana, it produces an extra mana. So this is little creature modification, or enhancement rather, as well as mana ramp, which gets us more into the enhancement stuff I've got. True Conviction. Here again, it's a fairly costly enchantment to play for 3 white, white, white. But creatures I control have double strike and lifelink. Beastmaster Ascension for 2 and a green. If a creature I control attacks, put a quest counter on Ascension. Once it has 7 or more, my creatures will get +5/+5. So if this is on the battlefield and I swing with 7 creatures, they all immediately get +5/+5 before their damage is dealt. One of the cheaper enchantments in this set, or in this deck, Intangible Virtue. For 1 and a white, creature tokens I control get +1/+1 in Vigilance. In a deck that actually played and did more damage through its normal creatures, this is obviously less of a good thing to have. But as I've said, the whole thing with this deck is I make creature tokens. Cathor's Crusade for 3 white, white. Creature enters the battlefield under my control. Put a 1/1 counter on each creature I control. If I have 5 creatures enter, then I'm going to be able to put 5 counters on every creature I control. This actually pairs very well with Felidar Retreat. 3 and a white. It has landfall. When a land enters the battlefield under my control, I can either create a 2/2 white cat or put a 1/1 counter on each creature I control. Those creatures will gain vigilance till end of turn. Where I say they pair together, if these two are on the field, I play a land. I'll choose to create a cat. The cat entering will trigger Cathar's Crusade. So with Cathar's Crusade on the field, I effectively get both modes of Felidar Retreat. Shark Typhoon. This is definitely for token generation. 5 and a blue. I cast a non-creature spell. I get an XX Flying Shark. X is the spell's converted mana cost. I can cycle this for X, 1 and blue to create an XX Flying Shark. I've never actually cycled it though. I play a lot of non-creature spells in this deck, so I could make a lot of sharks. Luminarch's Ascension for 1 and a white. Beginning of each opponent's end step, if I didn't lose life, put a counter on it. If it has 4 or more counters on it, for a white and 1, I can make a 4/4 Flying Angel. So if I manage to make it 4 turns of my opponent's turn, or 4 of my opponent's turns without taking damage, this comes online fairly quickly, and then it's a mana sink that can generate a lot of tokens. Hallowed Haunting for 2 white and white. If I control 7 or more enchantments, my creatures have flying and vigilance. But the big thing is whenever I play an enchantment spell, I get a white spirit token. Spirits' power and toughness are equal to the number of spirits I control. I have 3 spirits. They're all 3/3s. So this can scale fairly quickly as well with the number of enchantments that I have. Sigil of the Empty Throne. 3 white and white. Cast an enchantment. Create a 4/4 Flying Angel. We're into kind of a protection phase of the enchantments now. For 2 and a white, this is Ghostly Prison. Creatures can't attack me unless their controllers pay 2 for each attacking creature. Or for each creature he or she controls that's attacking me specifically. So they can attack my opponents all they choose. Sphere of Safety is kind of the same thing, but a little better, but also more expensive. Mana-wise, for 4 and a white, those creatures' controllers will have to pay X for each, where X is the number of enchantments I control. So Ghostly Prison, it's 2 right off the bat. Sphere of Safety, with just Sphere of Safety on the board, it's going to be 1. If I have 5 enchantments, they're paying 5 per attacking creature to attack me. Sylvan Library, it's kind of card advantage, but for 1 and a green, beginning of my draw step, draw 2 extra cards. Or I may draw 2 extra cards. If I do, I have to pick 2 cards that I drew this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put them on the top of my library. So basically, I draw 3 cards. If I want to pay 8 life, I can keep all 3 cards. Or if nothing else, I can filter the best one for me to draw that turn. And not pay any life. Usually, unless I'm getting low on life, I'll pay the 8 and draw all 3. Heuristic Study, this is another classic that's pretty well known. 2 and a blue, opponent casts a spell, I draw a card unless they pay 1. Mystic Remora, It's just a blue to cast. Now it does have a cumulative upkeep of 1, so the first time I untap with this on the battlefield, I have to pay 1. The second time 2. The 5th time I've untapped with this on the field, I'm paying 5 mana if I choose to keep it. But anytime an opponent successfully casts a non-creature spell, I draw a card unless they pay 4. A lot of people would swap this out for Esper Sentinel. You have to excuse the clicking noise. The Snowbell of the Pyrenees just decided to get up and walk around. But Esper Sentinel doesn't have the cumulative upkeep, but it's only their first non-creature spell, and they have to pay mana equal to Esper's power at the time. So if it's a 1/1 creature. So if you haven't boosted it up, they can pay 1. In this case, it's a much steeper cost for them to pay. Enchantress's Presence. This is card advantage. For 2 and a green, I cast an enchantment spell. I draw a card. Sterling Grove. A white and a green. My other enchantments will have Shroud, which, none of my stuff can be targeted at that point. But also, this is the only tutor I have in the deck as far as being able to tutor for something other than lands. For 1 mana, I can sack Sterling Grove, search my library for any enchantment I want, reveal it, and put it on top. We've got several token doublers in this set, or in this deck. Anointed Procession for 3 and a white. Double any tokens I create. Doubling Season is actually a step up from that. For 4 and a green, it doubles the tokens, but it also doubles the counters I create. So if I have an effect that tells me to put a 1/1 counter on a creature or all creatures, with Doubling Season, I would put 2. Parallel Lives is kind of the green version of the Anointed Procession. 3 and a green, double the tokens I create. We run 2 different ley lines in this deck. Ley Line of Anticipation, 2 blue and blue. My spells will all have flash, or rather I can play my spells as though they had flash. With the ley lines, if this is in my opening hand, it starts the game on the battlefield on turn 0, so before anyone has done anything. The white version of that, again for 2, and this is white, Ley Line of Sanctity, gives me hexproof, so I can't be targeted by anything. One of the cards that I have in here that involves the Monarch mechanic is Court of Grace for 2 white and white. Court of Grace enters the battlefield. I become the Monarch. At the beginning of my upkeep, I get a 1/1 white spirit with flying, but if I'm the Monarch, I get a 4/4 white angel with flying instead. And the Monarch basically says, once I'm the Monarch, I remain the Monarch unless an opponent does combat damage to me, in which case they would become the Monarch. And if you are the Monarch on your instep, you draw a card. The green court that I'm running is Court of Bounty for 2 green and green. Same as before, it enters the battlefield, I become the Monarch. My upkeep, I put a land on the battlefield from my hand. If I'm the Monarch, I can put a creature or a land, whichever I choose. Again, there's not a ton of creature cards in this deck. Rest in Peace is an enchantment for 1 and a white. Enters the battlefield, exile all graveyards. If a card or token would be put into the graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So this completely shuts down any graveyard recursion that my opponents are doing, as well as it keeps things from going into my graveyard to pair with another card I have, which is energy field. For 1 and a blue, prevent all damage from sources I don't control. If a card is put into my graveyard, I have to sacrifice energy field. So with Rest in Peace on the field, energy field gets to stay because nothing ever goes to my graveyard. And energy field basically says nobody can hurt me but me. Doesn't matter, it's not a matter of targeting, combat damage, anything. If it's not a source I control, it cannot do any damage to me. That would also pair with Will of Sun and Moon, which in a lot of ways is actually better than Rest in Peace. We've got 2 in the Selesnya hybrid colors. So 2 mana, any combination of white and green. Enchant player, I would enchant myself. If a card would be put into my graveyard from anywhere, instead reveal it and put it on the bottom of my library. And with some of the lands and such that I have, I'm going to be shuffling my library occasionally, and I can cycle those cards back to the top. As well as this keeps anything from hitting my graveyard, which would therefore protect energy field. The last enchantment I have is In Search of Greatness. I wasn't really sure what category to put this one in, but it's for green. Beginning of my upkeep, I can cast and this is actually a cast, so it would trigger my enchantresses that I get to draw on cast, or on the casting of an enchantment. But I may cast a permanent spell from my hand with converted mana cost equal to exactly 1 plus the highest converted mana cost among other permanents I control. So if I have an energy field on the field, and that is the most expensive permanent other than In Search of Greatness that I have. Energy field's converted mana cost is 2. So I would be able to play something with a converted mana cost of 3 from my hand for free. If I don't play that or cast a permanent of the appropriate mana cost for free, then instead I can scry 1. Scrying's always a good thing as well. The only thing that leaves to go over is the lands. There are 37 lands in this set, but there are a lot of 2-color mana producing lands. So with 37 lands, I end up with a total of 18 green sources, 16 white, and 15 blue. So chances are I should have whatever colors I need to cast whatever spells I'm wanting to cast. I do have these broken down into different cycles for the most part. To start with, we have the dual lands. The copies I have are from Revised. These are ones that if you are wanting to keep it budget, you don't even attempt to put these in your deck. The original dual lands are not cheap to find. I originally wanted to start collecting them because I do feel they'll go up in value. But here, the first one we have is the Savannah. So Savannah counts as a forest and a plains. So I can fetch it with something that says find a forest or plains. It does not enter the battlefield tapped, but I can tap it for green or white. We also have the Tundra, which is the island forest version. And the Tropical Island is the Tundra, I'm sorry, is the island plains version. The Tropical Island is the forest island. Then we have the Shocklands. These are also fetchable in that they typically count as 2 different land types. In the case of Temple Garden, it is a forest and a plains. These enter tapped, but if I need them to come in untapped, I can pay 2 life. But the forest plains is for Temple Garden. Breeding Pool is the forest island version, so it produces green and blue. Hollowed fountain is the plains and island, so it produces white and blue. Then we have a cycle of lands that they enter tapped unless I control 2 or more other lands. So as long as this is not one of the first 2 lands I play, it comes in untapped. Deserted Beach produces white and blue. Dreamroot Cascade produces green and blue. Overgrown Farmland produces green and white. If you're seeing a pattern here, each of the land cycles, there are 3 in that cycle that fall into the colors I'm playing. So I'm typically running all 3. Then we have a cycle of lands that comes in tapped unless I have 2 or more opponents. So Commander is typically a multiplayer game, which makes these pretty good there. Rejuvenating Springs produces the green and blue. Bountiful Promenade is green and white. Sea of Clouds produces white and blue. Then the temples, not to be confused with Temple Garden, which I will frequently make that mistake while playing, but the temples come in tapped. There's no way for them to come in untapped. A lot of people would say I need to not run any of the tapped lands because they do slow it down a little. But when the temples come in, you get to scry 1, which is, in my opinion, worth the trade-off. But we have the Temple Enlightenment for white and blue, Temple of Plenty for green and white, and the Temple of Mystery for green and blue. Then we have a cycle of lands that comes in tapped unless I control 1 of 2 different land types. In the case of Sun Petal Grove, is for forest and plains. I can tap it for a green or white. Glacial Forest looks for plains or islands, can be tapped for white or blue. Hinterland Harbor looks for forest or island and can be tapped for green or blue. And in Zendikar Rising, they came out with what we call modal double-faced cards. These were cards that when it's in your hand, you consider the front face of the card, but when you play it, you can actually play it for that side or for the back side. Once they're on the battlefield, it's not like they can flip back and forth. It's you choose one at the time of playing or casting, because there were creatures and some enchantments and some sorceries that were modal double-faced. But at the time of casting or playing, you choose which side you want to do. In the case of Branch Loft for green, or I could play it as Boulder Loft for white. The Hinge Gate I could play for white, or Mist Gate for blue. Bark Channel could be played as a green source, or Tide Channel as a blue source. Then we've got our fetch lands. This Flooded Strand. With the fetch lands, they're all pretty much the same. The original fetch lands, you pay 1 life, tap, and sacrifice that card. Search your library for 1 of 2 land types. Put that land on the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. So with these, you can search for the shock lands. You can search for the original dual lands. There is actually a cycle of lands called the Tri-lands or the Triomes that count as 3 different land types. You could search for them. I don't run a Triome in this deck because at this time, there is not a Triome for green, white, and blue. But in the case of the Flooded Strand, I'm looking for either a plains or an island. Windswept Heath, and this is actually one of the nicer printings I have in this set, or in this deck. This is the original Zendikar Expeditions. There's definitely a budget version of this card. But Windswept Heath, I'm looking for a forest or plains. Misty Rainforest, I'm looking for a forest or an island. In any multicolor commander deck, you want Command Tower. Produce a mana of any color in my commander's color identity. Sarah Sanctum. This is another card that is definitely up there in price. However, this is not one I would say omit for budget reasons. To be able to tap for white equal to the number of enchantments you control in an all enchantment deck with roughly 40 enchantments. Despite the cost, this is definite ramp that you want in the deck. Obviously, you could omit it if you just don't want to go that high of a budget, but I'm not omitting it in my budget price for this deck just because it is so good. The original duels, for a cost of $500, you're not adding that much reliability, but for the cost of a Sarah Sanctum, it is actually doing an awful lot for your ramp. Reliquary Tower, this is another instance of the no max hand size. Again, like I said, very important in this deck. And it taps for a generic, or taps for a colorless. Gemstone Caverns. If you're not going first, and this card is in your opening hand, you can exile a card from your hand, and this starts on the battlefield on turn 0 with a luck counter on it. If it's got a luck counter on it, it makes mana of any color. So it's a lot of hoops to jump through. If you happen to have it in your opening hand and you happen to not be going first, it allows you to have 2 lands on turn 0, or sorry, 2 lands on turn 1, 3 if you're also playing, if you also happen to have exploration. Hall of Heliod's Generosity. This is some more graveyard recursion. I can either tap it for a colorless, or for 1, a white, and tap it. I can get an enchantment card from my graveyard and put it on top of my library. With the amount of card draw this deck can do, that can therefore get it into my hand. Maze of Ith. In case you haven't noticed, I don't really have any creature removal in this deck. The idea behind that is I can generate enough creatures that everything should be okay there. However, there will occasionally be creatures that I can't block, no matter how many creatures I have. That's where Maze of Ith comes in hand. Or Maze of Ith, I can tap it to untap target attacking creature, prevent all damage that will be dealt to and dealt by it this turn. So you swing in with something that's going to just really hurt me. It's going to do a lot to further your game, a lot to set me back. I tap Maze of Ith, you untap your creature, but it's like it never swung. Strip Mine. I can either tap it for a generic or for a colorless, or I can tap and sacrifice it to destroy a target land. I may at some point add more land destruction such as this, but basically you've got Gaia's Cradle on the field. Gaia's Cradle is going to do a lot to ramp you. I need Gaia's Cradle gone. Things such as that. Or there's I'm trying to think, and I'm drawing a blank for some reason. Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale. All of my creatures, or all creatures, would have an upkeep of 1. Strip Mine could destroy Tabernacle. Ancient Tomb is ramp. This is actually the Ultimate Masters box topper version. Again, there are more budget-friendly printings available, but I can tap it to add 2 colorless, and it will deal 2 damage to me. Field of the Dead. This is in here for token generation. Like I said, I have 37 lands in this set and only 4 basics. So that's a lot of lands of different names. Field of the Dead does enter tapped, and it only taps to produce a colorless. But when it or another land enters the battlefield under my control, if I control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature. Now with 37 lands and only 4 basics, like I said, that's a lot of lands of different types or different names. Basically means with Field of the Dead on the field, if I play a land and I have 7, I create a 2/2 zombie. I have 3 cards in this set that we saw that double, or in this deck, that double token generate or token creation. So in that case, I play a land, I make 2 zombies. Or with the case of Cathar's Crusade, I play a land, I make a zombie, I put a 1/1 counter on everything I have. So they kind of work together with some other cards. The only other lands in this deck, I mentioned that there are 4 basics. I have 1 plains and 3 forests. Again, this number may actually go down with time. Just as I see other lands that I want to put in their place. In any case, that's my version of Tuvasa. Like I said, it's token generation. I could have built the same deck that everybody else builds with it, which is Voltron. Voltron's strategy is weak in that if you manage to nerf the creature that has been boosted up, in the case of the Voltron decks, that's usually the commander, you manage to nerf, Tuvasa, then it doesn't matter that she's able to swing for 20 if she can't hit you or she can't attack, or you've destroyed her and I have to start over. But the real reason I built it this route is because I haven't seen it done. I like to get a little weird with the deck construction sometimes. It's just more fun. But in any case, like I said, that's my version. So hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do that. It definitely helps get the word out there. As well as feel free to like and share the video. That helps as well. But in any case, I'll talk to y'all later, and y'all have a good day.